The Sunday lunch rush had swallowed every seat in the café, except one empty chair at the corner table where Ford Bennett sat with his son. The space between them felt wider than the table itself. Jasper, 8 years old, hadn't looked up from his tablet in 20 minutes. Ford hadn't looked up from his laptop in longer. 2 years since the funeral, and they'd perfected the art of being alone together. Then the door swung open, bringing rain and a woman who moved like every step cost her something. One leg ended in metal and hard plastic below the knee. Her wet hair clung to her face, and she clutched a battered portfolio against her ribs, the kind artists carry to interviews they can't afford to miss. Her eyes swept the packed room with quiet desperation. No empty tables, no empty chairs, except theirs. She limped toward them, and Ford felt his jaw tighten, ready to say no, ready to protect their bubble of expensive isolation. But before he could speak, she asked, "Can I share this table? I have an interview in 10 minutes across the street." Her voice shook, not from cold, from something older. Ford opened his mouth, and his son, his silent, unreachable son, looked up for the first time in months and said, "Yes." One word, one stranger, one choice that would crack open everything they'd buried. Quinn Reeves hadn't expected the yes. She'd prepared herself for the polite shake of the head, the apologetic smile that meant get lost. Rich men in tailored shirts didn't share tables with women who smelled like rain and desperation. But the boy had spoken, and now she was lowering herself into the chair, her prosthetic leg clicking softly against the floor. The sound always embarrassed her, that mechanical whisper that announced her brokenness to everyone within earshot. She set her portfolio on the edge of the table, careful not to intrude on their space. The father was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not disgust, not pity, but something closer to confusion, as if his son had just spoken a language he didn't understand. The boy had already returned to his tablet, but Quinn caught the way his eyes flickered toward her every few seconds. Curious. Lonely. She recognized that look. She'd seen it in mirrors for 3 years. Ford felt the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. Jasper had spoken. To a stranger. Without prompting. Without negotiation. Without the careful scaffolding of therapeutic techniques they'd been building since the day they'd buried his mother. Just yes. Simple and devastating. He wanted to ask his son why, wanted to understand what had shifted in that small body. But the woman was settling into her chair now, and he couldn't very well interrogate his child in front of her. So he did what he always did when emotions threatened to surface. He returned his attention to his laptop, to the quarterly reports that needed his signature, to the safe territory of numbers and projections. But his eyes kept drifting to the portfolio she'd placed on the table. Battered brown leather, corners worn soft from years of handling. An artist's case. He wondered what she carried inside, what dreams she was about to present to someone across the street who would probably crush them with a handshake and a "we'll call you." The cafe hummed around them with the comfortable chaos of a Sunday afternoon. Steam hissed from the espresso machine behind the counter. Silverware clinked against ceramic. Someone laughed too loud at a joke Ford couldn't hear. Quinn pulled out her phone to check the time, 8 minutes until her interview, and tried to calm the tremor in her hands. She'd been up since 4 in the morning, preparing her presentation, rehearsing her answers to questions she could anticipate and questions she couldn't. This was her 7th interview in 3 months. The first 6 had ended the same way, with hiring managers finding creative reasons to explain why she wasn't quite right for the position. Too qualified, they'd say, when what they meant was too damaged. She could see it in their eyes, the way their gaze would drop to her prosthetic and then snap back up. guilty and obvious. But she needed this job. Needed it in a way that went beyond rent and groceries, beyond the practical mathematics of survival. She needed to prove she was still useful, still capable, still worthy of taking up space in the world. Jasper's game made soft beeping sounds. Ford's keyboard clicked in irregular rhythm. Quinn sat frozen between them, trying to be invisible, trying not to disrupt whatever delicate ecosystem existed in this corner of the cafe. But then Jasper spoke again, his voice small and uncertain. "What's in your folder?" Quinn blinked, startled. The boy was looking at her now, really looking, his dark eyes too old for his face. She glanced at Ford, seeking permission, but he seemed as surprised as she was. "Drawings," she said carefully. "I'm an art therapist. Or, I was. I'm trying to be one again." Jasper tilted his head, considering this. "Can I see?" Ford opened his mouth to intervene, to explain that his son didn't usually ask strangers questions, didn't usually ask anyone anything. But Quinn was already unzipping the portfolio. Her hands moved with practiced care, pulling out a sheet of heavy paper and turning it toward Jasper. The drawing showed a child in a hospital bed, bald from chemotherapy, but smiling. Around the bed, Quinn had sketched flowers growing up from the floor, their stems twining around the IV stand, their blooms opening toward a window where sunlight poured in like liquid gold. The child's hands were reaching toward the flowers, and there was joy in the gesture, pure and uncomplicated. Jasper stared at the image for a long moment. Then he asked, "Why are they smiling if they're sick?" His voice cracked on the last word, and Ford's heart cracked with it. Quinn leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her entire focus on the boy. "Because sometimes joy is the best medicine," she said softly. "Being sick doesn't mean you can't be happy. It just means you have to work a little harder to find the happiness." Jasper's finger traced the edge of the paper, careful not to smudge the graphite. "My mom was sick," he whispered. She didn't smile very much at the end. The air in the cafe seemed to contract. Ford's hands had gone still on his keyboard. Quinn's breath caught in her throat. She looked at this small boy, this child carrying grief like a stone in his pocket, and felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition, a mirror. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in a way that went deeper than courtesy. "I bet she smiled more than you think, though. Sometimes when people are really sick, they save their smiles for the moments that matter most, for the people they love most." Jasper's eyes were wet now, but he didn't look away from the drawing. "Do you draw sick kids because someone you love was sick?" The question was so direct, so fearless in its honesty, that Quinn almost laughed. Children saw through pretense in ways adults had forgotten how to do. "I draw sick kids because I used to help them feel less scared," she said. "And because my little brother was one of them. He had leukemia. He died when he was 7. She didn't know why she was telling this child her deepest wound, spilling her grief onto a cafe table in front of a stranger and his father. But something about Jasper's question had opened a door she usually kept locked. Ford was no longer pretending to work. He was watching Quinn with an intensity that would have made her uncomfortable if she'd noticed, but she was focused entirely on his son. Jasper had set down his tablet, actually set it down, face down on the table, something he never did, and was pulling the drawing closer. "What was his name?" Jasper asked. "Leo," Quinn said, and even after 3 years, the name still tasted like loss. He loved superheroes and dinosaurs, and he hated broccoli so much he once tried to feed it to the hospital goldfish. Jasper's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Did the fish die? No, but the nurse who caught him made him eat double broccoli at dinner. This time Jasper did smile, just a flicker. But Ford saw it and felt something in his chest that might have been hope. Quinn checked her phone again, 3 minutes, and began carefully sliding the drawing back into her portfolio. But Jasper reached out, his small hand hovering over hers. "Can you draw me sometime?" he asked. "If you get the job, if you come back here." Quinn looked at Ford then, really looked at him, seeking permission or rejection or something to guide her response. What she saw surprised her. A man terrified of hope, terrified of connection, terrified of anything that might crack the protective shell he'd built around himself and his son. But beneath the terror, something else. A desperate, drowning need for exactly what she'd just given Jasper. A moment of genuine human contact. Ford knew he should say no, should explain that they didn't make plans with strangers, didn't extend invitations that implied future encounters. His life had been carefully calibrated for 2 years to avoid exactly this kind of complication. But Jasper was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen since before the funeral. Anticipation. Want. The possibility of something good. So Ford heard himself say, "We're here most Sundays. Same table." Quinn's eyes widened slightly, and Ford saw the moment she understood what he was really saying. "You can come back. You're allowed to exist in our space. You're not invisible." She stood carefully, gathering her portfolio, her phone, the dignity she'd carried in with her. "Thank you," she said. And the gratitude in her voice went far beyond a shared table. "For the chair, for letting me show him the drawing, for—" She stopped, unable to articulate what she meant. "For treating me like a person, maybe. For not looking away." Jasper lifted his hand in a small wave as she turned toward the door. Ford watched her go, watched the way she moved through the crowded café with her head high, despite the limp, despite the stares, despite everything. When she disappeared into the rain, he looked at his son. Jasper had picked up his tablet again, but he wasn't playing. He was just holding it, staring at the blank screen. "Why did you say yes?" Ford asked, his voice rough. Jasper didn't look up. "She looked like she needed somewhere to sit," he said simply. And maybe, Ford thought, that was the whole truth. Sometimes people just needed somewhere to sit. Quinn didn't get the job. The interview went exactly as she'd expected, polite interest dissolving into careful distance the moment the hiring manager's eyes landed on her prosthetic. "We'll be in touch," they said, which was a kind way of saying, "Don't call us." She limped back through the rain, her portfolio heavy with rejection, and found herself standing outside the cafe again. Through the window, she could see the corner table. Empty now. Father and son had gone home to whatever life they lived when they weren't sitting in careful silence. She should go too. Should head back to the shelter before curfew. Should save her bus fare. Should stop pretending that one kind gesture from a stranger meant anything beyond momentary politeness. But her feet carried her inside anyway, to the counter, where she bought a cup of coffee she couldn't afford and sat at a different table, in a different corner, where she could take out her sketchbook and draw. Her hands moved across the paper almost without conscious thought, creating lines that became shapes, that became a boy, with old eyes and a careful smile. Jasper. She didn't know why she was drawing him, only that something about their brief exchange had lodged itself under her ribs and needed to come out. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm Quinn hadn't intended. Every Sunday, she would make her way to the cafe, not to the corner table. She wouldn't presume that far, but to her own space near the window where she could watch the door and pretend she wasn't waiting for anyone in particular. And every Sunday, around noon, Ford and Jasper would arrive. The first Sunday, they didn't notice her. The second, Ford's eyes swept past her without recognition. But the third Sunday, Jasper saw her. His face lit up in a way that made Ford stop mid-step, following his son's gaze to the woman by the window. Quinn lifted her hand in a small wave, uncertain. Jasper was already moving toward her, Ford following with visible reluctance. "You came back," Jasper said, the wonder in his voice making Quinn's throat tight. "I come here sometimes to draw," she admitted, gesturing to her sketchbook. A lie, but a harmless one. She came here to see if they would return, to see if that moment of connection had been real or imagined. Ford stood behind his son, hands in his pockets, the picture of a man unsure whether to stay or flee. "We're at our usual table," Ford said finally, and there was something in his tone that Quinn couldn't quite decode. "If you'd like to join us, since it's crowded today." It wasn't crowded. There were at least 5 empty tables. But Quinn understood what he was really offering. Permission. Acceptance. The possibility of repetition. She gathered her things and followed them to the corner, and this time when she sat down, it felt less like trespassing and more like belonging. Jasper scooted his chair closer to hers, angling his body so he could see what she was drawing. Ford opened his laptop, but didn't look at it. His attention split between his son and this woman who had somehow become part of their Sunday routine, without anyone quite deciding it should happen. They didn't talk much that day. Quinn sketched while Jasper watched, occasionally asking questions about her technique, about why she chose certain lines over others. Ford ordered food, sandwiches and fruit, more than 2 people needed, and pushed half of it toward Quinn with a casual gesture that was anything but casual. She ate it because refusing would acknowledge the charity, and acknowledging it would make them both uncomfortable. This was easier, pretending they were just 3 people sharing a table, sharing a meal, sharing space without consequence. The 4th Sunday, Quinn brought small origami figures, a crane, a flower, a tiny boat, and taught Jasper how to fold them. His fingers were clumsy at first, tearing the paper, creasing it wrong, but she showed him again and again with infinite patience until he got it right. Ford watched his son's face transform with concentration and pride, and felt something he'd thought was dead stir back to life. The 5th Sunday, Jasper asked Quinn about her leg. Ford tensed, ready to apologize, to explain that his son didn't understand social boundaries, but Quinn just smiled. "I was in a car accident 3 years ago," she said, her voice steady. "I was rushing to get to the hospital during a storm. My little brother needed me, and I thought if I just drove faster, just pushed harder, I could make it in time. But I lost control on a wet road, hit a barrier. They had to amputate below the knee to save my life." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to her thigh. "I made it to the hospital 2 hours after Leo died. 2 hours. He died alone because I wasn't fast enough." The silence that followed was profound. Ford found himself reaching across the table, his hand covering hers before he could think better of it. Quinn looked up, surprised, and saw tears on his face. "My wife died of heart failure," he said quietly. "She was sick for 2 years, and I had every resource, every specialist, every treatment money could buy, and none of it mattered. She died anyway, and I was holding her hand, and I was with her, but I couldn't save her. I was right there, and I couldn't save her." It was the first time he'd said those words aloud, the first time he'd admitted that the money, the power, the carefully constructed empire of his life had meant nothing in the face of cellular failure and the indifferent mathematics of mortality. Jasper was looking between them with wide eyes, understanding more than either adult realized. I don't remember Mom's last words, he said, his voice very small. I was there, but I don't remember. I've tried and tried, but I can't remember. Quinn reached for the boy then, pulling him against her side. He didn't resist. Maybe you're not supposed to remember the last words, she said. Maybe you're supposed to remember all the other ones. All the times she said I love you and good morning and be careful and eat your vegetables. Those are the words that matter. Ford felt something crack open in his chest. All this time, he'd been so focused on preserving his grief, on maintaining the careful distance that kept him safe from further loss, that he'd forgotten how to let his son actually mourn. How to let either of them feel anything beyond the numbing weight of absence. Quinn had been with them for 5 Sundays, and she'd done more for Jasper than 2 years of expensive therapy. Not because she was trained, though she was, but because she understood. She'd been in the same dark place, was still finding her way out, and could see them struggling in the shadows. When Jasper finally pulled back, his face was wet, but peaceful. Can you teach me to draw? He asked Quinn. Like you do. The pictures that make sad things beautiful. Quinn looked at Ford, seeking permission. He nodded. I'd like that, she said. I'd like that very much. And so the Sundays continued, but they were different now. Deeper, more honest. Quinn would bring her sketch pad and teach Jasper about light and shadow, about how to see the world as shapes and values rather than objects and labels. Ford would work less and watch more, learning from Quinn how to be present with his son, how to allow sadness without drowning in it. Sometimes they talked about grief, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes Quinn would tell stories about Leo, funny ones, ridiculous ones, the kind that made Jasper laugh and made Ford see that loss didn't have to erase joy. 8 weeks in, Ford's assistant did a background check. He'd resisted it for weeks, telling himself it was an invasion of privacy, that Quinn's past was her own business. But protective instinct won out over courtesy. What he found shook him. Quinn Reeves, 27 years old, former art therapist at Children's Memorial Hospital. Excellent employment record until 3 years ago, when she'd been involved in a single-car accident on the night of her brother's death. She'd spent 4 months in physical rehabilitation, another 6 in psychological therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. She'd been dismissed from her position, officially for extended leave beyond acceptable limits, unofficially because parents complained about having a visibly disabled therapist working with their children. Since then, a string of rejection letters, denied applications, temporary positions that never became permanent. She'd been living in her car until 6 months ago, when a bed opened up at a women's shelter downtown. The address on her job applications was a post office box. Ford sat in his study, the report spread across his desk, and felt ashamed of his privilege. While he'd been drowning in grief in his $10 million house, Quinn had been drowning in grief in a shelter bed. While his son had access to the best therapists money could buy, she'd been teaching herself to walk again on a prosthetic covered by charity care. While he'd had the luxury of withdrawal, she'd been fighting every single day just to maintain the dignity of employment. The next Sunday, Ford arrived early. He was waiting at the corner table when Quinn limped in, surprise crossing her face when she saw him alone. "Where's Jasper?" she asked, setting down her bag. "Home with his grandmother," Ford said. "I wanted to talk to you, just us." Quinn's face went carefully neutral. This was it then. He'd realized she was getting too close, was going to ask her to stop coming around, to leave them alone. She'd prepared herself for this moment, had known it was coming. People like her didn't get to keep good things. "I know about the accident," Ford said. "I know about your brother, about the hospital, about where you're living. I had you investigated. And I'm not sorry about that, because my son's safety comes first. But I am sorry for invading your privacy." Quinn sat down heavily. Of course he'd investigated. Rich people always investigated. "So now you know I'm damaged goods," she said, aiming for light and landing somewhere near bitter. "Is this where you explain that we appreciate my time, but it's best if I don't come around anymore?" Ford looked at her like she'd struck him. "What? No. God, no. Quinn, you've been the best thing to happen to Jasper since his mother died. You've been the best thing to happen to me since his mother died. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking if you'll let me help you." Quinn's defenses shot up immediately. "I don't need charity. It's not charity, it's employment." Ford pulled a folder from his bag, not unlike Quinn's portfolio, but newer, leather, still stiff with lack of use. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation, in my wife's name. She always wanted to do more for children's health care, but she ran out of time. I want to create a therapeutic arts program, free services for kids in hospitals, in hospices, in situations where their families can't afford the extras that make terrible things slightly less terrible. I need someone to design it, to run it, to make it actually work, instead of being another rich person's tax write-off. I'm asking if you'll be that person." Quinn stared at him. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a purpose. And yes, a salary. A real one. Benefits. An office. Resources. Everything you need to do what you're actually trained to do, what you're brilliant at, without having to convince small-minded hiring managers that your prosthetic doesn't affect your brain." Ford leaned forward, his intensity almost uncomfortable. "You saved my son, Quinn. You saved me. Let me give you a chance to save yourself." Quinn's eyes were burning. This was too much, too fast, too close to the fantasy she'd stopped letting herself imagine. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this for me? We barely know each other." "Because my wife died asking me to be better," Ford said simply. "To do more with what we'd been given. To not let wealth make me blind to people who need help. I've been failing at that for 2 years. You're giving me a chance to succeed." The offer sat between them like a live thing, pulsing with possibility and terror. Quinn knew she should be grateful, should say yes immediately, should fall at his feet with thanks. But doubt crept in with familiar poison. What if she failed? What if she couldn't do the work anymore? What if the PTSD came back the moment she stepped into a hospital room and saw a bald child in a bed? What if she was broken beyond repair, and accepting this job would only prove it to everyone? "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm so scared. I'll let you down." Ford reached across the table, taking her hand. His palm was warm, solid, real. "Then we'll be scared together," he said. "But we'll try anyway. That's all anyone can do, right? Just try." Quinn looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift. A door opening. A path forward. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, being broken didn't mean being finished. "Okay," she said. "Yes. I'll do it." The foundation launched 3 months later in a small office downtown. Quinn threw herself into the work with ferocious dedication, designing programs, reaching out to hospitals, training volunteers. Ford provided funding and connections, but stayed out of her way creatively, trusting her expertise. Slowly, carefully, Quinn began to heal. Not in the sense of forgetting. She would never forget Leo, would never stop carrying that loss, but in the sense of learning to live around it, to build a life that included grief without being defined by it. She moved out of the shelter into a small apartment. Nothing fancy, but hers. A place where she could hang her own drawings on the walls, where she could cook meals instead of eating from food banks, where she could close a door and have privacy. Ford helped with the security deposit, calling it an advance on her salary, but they both knew it was more than that. It was an investment in her future, a statement of belief that she had one. Jasper visited the foundation office after school twice a week. Quinn would teach him art techniques, and he would help her organize supplies, and they would talk about his day, and his feelings, and his mother, in ways that felt natural instead of forced. He called her Quinn now, not Miss Quinn, and sometimes he would hug her goodbye, his thin arms tight around her waist. Ford would pick him up, and sometimes he would stay for coffee, and sometimes they would just talk about the foundation, about Jasper, about nothing in particular. The careful distance between them was eroding, replaced by something warmer. Friendship, certainly. But underneath that, something neither of them was quite ready to name: trust, affection, the possibility of more. 6 months after the foundation launched, Quinn was leading an art therapy session at Children's Memorial, her first time back since the accident. She stood outside the pediatric oncology ward, her hand on the door handle, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. This was the floor where Leo had died, where she'd arrived too late, where she'd stood in the hallway and screamed until security had to escort her out. The door opened from the inside, and a nurse stepped through. "You must be Quinn," she said warmly. "The kids have been so excited to meet you. Come on in." Quinn's legs wouldn't move. Couldn't move. The prosthetic felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The nurse's expression softened with understanding. "First time back?" Quinn nodded, unable to speak. "I was in a car accident. My brother died here 3 years ago. I haven't been back since." The nurse took her hand, the gesture matter-of-fact and kind. "He'd want you here, helping other kids. You know he would." That simple truth was enough. Quinn took a breath, then another, and walked through the door. The session was hard, harder than she'd imagined. Every bald head reminded her of Leo. Every IV pole, every beeping monitor, every parent sitting vigil in a bedside chair. But it was also beautiful. The children responded to her immediately, drawn to her honesty about her prosthetic, about her grief, about the ways art had helped her survive. She taught them to draw their pain, to shape it into something they could look at and understand, and maybe, eventually, transform. One girl, maybe 9 years old, drew a picture of herself with wings. "For when I die," she explained calmly, "so I can fly away and not be sick anymore." Quinn's throat closed, but she didn't look away. "That's a powerful image," she said. "Can I tell you something?" The girl nodded. "My brother had wings, too. I couldn't see them when he was alive, but I see them now. Big ones, strong ones. And I think maybe wings aren't just for dying. Maybe they're for all the times we need to rise above the hard stuff while we're still here." The girl considered this. Then she drew another picture, herself with wings, but standing on the ground. Flying, but still here. Still present. Still fighting. That night, Quinn called Ford from her apartment. It was late, past 10. But when she'd gotten home, she'd felt so full of emotion she thought she might burst if she didn't share it with someone. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep. "Quinn, are you okay?" "I did it," she said, and her voice was shaking with something that might have been joy. "I went back to the hospital. I ran a session. I was terrified, and it was hard, and I cried in my car afterward for 20 minutes. But I did it, Ford. I actually did it." She could hear the smile in his voice. "I never doubted you would." "Liar. You absolutely doubted. You were probably taking bets on how long before I called you in a panic." "Okay, fine. I had concerns, but I also had faith. There's a difference." Quinn laughed, the sound surprising her. When had laughing become easy again? "Thank you," she said, "for the foundation. For believing in me. For being—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. "For being exactly what I needed, when I needed it most. For seeing me when I was invisible. For giving me a reason to try again." "You don't have to thank me," Ford said quietly. "You gave me my son back. You gave me a reason to care about something beyond quarterly earnings and board meetings. If anyone should be thanking anyone, it's me thanking you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the phone line connecting them across the dark city. "Ford," Quinn said. "Yeah? I think I'm falling in love with you." The words were out before she could stop them, honest and terrifying, and absolutely true. She heard Ford's sharp intake of breath, waited for the rejection, the gentle letdown, the explanation that he valued her as an employee and friend, but nothing more. Instead, he said, "I know. I've been falling in love with you since the day Jasper said yes. I just didn't know if I was allowed to want it." "Are you allowed to want it?" Quinn asked, her heart in her throat. "I don't know, but I'm done pretending I don't." Ford's voice was rough with emotion. "Can I see you, now? I know it's late, but I need to see you." Quinn gave him her address, and 20 minutes later, he was knocking on her door. She opened it to find him in sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair messed from sleep, looking nothing like the polished businessman from the café. Looking, instead, like a man who'd driven across town in the middle of the night because he couldn't wait until morning. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Ford stepped inside, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, both of them afraid of breaking something precious. But then Quinn's arms came up around his neck, and Ford pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something desperate and needful and absolutely right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ford pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "Of this, of us, of what it means if I let myself love you and then lose you too." "I'm terrified too," Quinn said. "But I'm more terrified of not trying." They stood in her tiny apartment living room, holding each other. Two broken people learning that broken doesn't mean finished, that scars can be beautiful, that sometimes the person you need to save you is the person who needs saving too. "What do we tell Jasper?" Ford asked. Quinn smiled against his shoulder. "We tell him the truth, that sometimes grown-ups who are sad find each other and make each other less sad. That loving someone new doesn't mean forgetting someone old, that it's okay to be happy again." Ford pulled back to look at her. "You're going to be such a good mother to him." The words hung in the air, enormous and impossible and perfect. Quinn's eyes filled with tears. "I want that," she whispered. "I want to be part of your family. I want to wake up in the morning and make breakfast and fight about who has to take out the trash and all the boring, normal, beautiful things that make a life." "Then let's do it," Ford said. "Let's build that life together." And they did. 18 months later, Ford stood at the back of the foundation's new facility, watching Quinn lead a workshop for 20 children. The space had grown far beyond anything he'd initially imagined. 3 full-time art therapists, a rotating staff of volunteers, partnerships with 6 hospitals, and 4 hospices. Quinn had built something remarkable, something that would outlive all of them. Jasper was at the front of the room, demonstrating a watercolor technique to a girl about his age. He'd become Quinn's unofficial assistant, helping with younger children, sharing his own experience with loss in ways that gave them permission to share theirs. He called Quinn Mom now. It had happened gradually, naturally, the word appearing one morning at breakfast and then staying. Ford had cried the first time he'd heard it, and Quinn had cried too, and Jasper had rolled his eyes with all the exasperation of a 10-year-old who thought adults were ridiculous, but he'd been smiling. Always smiling these days. Quinn looked up and caught Ford watching. She raised her eyebrows in question. "You okay?" And he nodded, mouthing the words, "I love you." She pressed her hand to her heart in response, their private signal, their secret language. The workshop ended, and children scattered to parents and caregivers, clutching their artwork. One mother stopped to shake Quinn's hand, tears in her eyes. "You don't know what you've given my daughter," she said. "The ability to express what she's feeling instead of holding it inside. The permission to be odd and scared and still create beauty. Thank you." Quinn hugged her, this stranger who'd trusted her with a suffering child. "Thank you for letting me be part of her journey," she said. When the room finally emptied, Quinn came to stand beside Ford. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. Jasper was packing up art supplies, humming tunelessly, perfectly content in the space they'd built together. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Quinn asked. "That day in the café, when I asked to share your table." Ford smiled. "You mean when you crashed into our lives and refused to leave? I was terrified you'd say no. I was terrified Jasper would say yes, and then he did, and I realized I'd been waiting for someone to say yes for 2 years. I just hadn't known it." Quinn turned to face him fully. "I have something to tell you." Ford's heart jumped. "Okay." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. For a moment he didn't understand. Then understanding crashed over him like a wave. We're pregnant. 8 weeks. I found out yesterday." Quinn's eyes were bright with joy and fear. "I know we didn't plan this, and if you're not ready, if it's too soon." Ford kissed her, silencing the words. When he pulled back, he was laughing. "A baby. We're having a baby. Jasper's going to lose his mind." "In a good way?" "In the best way." Ford pulled her into a hug so tight she squeaked. Jasper looked up from the art supplies. "What's going on?" "Come here, buddy," Ford called. "We have something to tell you." Jasper approached cautiously, reading the happiness on their faces. "What?" "You're going to be a big brother," Quinn said. For a moment, Jasper just stared. Then he let out a whoop that probably violated noise ordinances and launched himself at both of them, his arms around their waists, his laughter filling the room. "This is the best thing ever," he shouted. "Can we name them Leo if it's a boy?" "After Quinn's brother?" Quinn's breath caught. She looked at Ford, who nodded, his eyes wet. "Yeah, buddy," she managed. "We can absolutely do that." The three of them stood together in the empty studio, sunlight streaming through the windows, art supplies scattered on tables, the faint smell of paint and possibility in the air. A family. Not the family any of them had imagined, not the family they'd lost, but the family they'd built from wreckage and grief, and the courage to try again. That night, after Jasper was in bed, Quinn and Ford sat on the couch in their living room. Not Ford's house, not Quinn's apartment, but the place they'd chosen together 6 months after admitting they were in love. A compromise space, big enough for a family, but not so big. It felt empty. Quinn rested her head on Ford's shoulder, his hand on her still flat stomach. "Do you think your wife would approve?" she asked. "Of us? Of this?" Ford considered the question seriously. "I think she'd be happy I'm not alone. that Jasper's not alone. She always said I was hopeless at taking care of myself. He paused. And I think Leo would be happy. You're happy. That you're using what happened to him to help other kids, other families. I hope so, Quinn whispered. I hope they both know we haven't forgotten them. We could never forget them, Ford said. They're part of how we found each other, part of what we carry forward. Quinn turned to look at him, this man who'd started as a stranger at a crowded table and become her partner, her love, her home. Can I tell you something? Always. That day at the cafe, when I asked to share your table, I almost didn't. I almost just left, found somewhere else to wait out my interview. I was so tired of asking for things, so tired of being the person who needed help. But something made me walk over to you and Jasper. Some instinct I didn't even understand. Ford tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. What instinct? That you needed me as much as I needed you. That we were all drowning in different ways, and maybe if we held on to each other, we could find air. She smiled. Turns out I was right. Turns out you were brilliant, Ford corrected, and brave, and persistent, and every other good thing. And you were kind, Quinn said. When you could have said no, when you had every right to protect your space and your son, you said yes. Or rather, Jasper said yes, and you didn't override him. Best decision I never made, Ford said, and kissed her again. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows in familiar rhythm. The same sound that had been in the air the day they'd met. But this time, instead of running from it, they sat together in the warmth and safety of home, listening to it drum against the glass like applause. In the morning, they would start again, would face whatever challenges came with building a family, with running a foundation, with bringing new life into a world that could be cruel and beautiful in equal measure. But tonight, they had this: each other, their son sleeping safely down the hall, and a future that finally looked less like an ending and more like a beginning. Quinn thought of the drawing she'd made that first day, the sketch of Jasper she'd created without knowing he would become her son. She'd kept it, framed it, hung it in their bedroom. Every morning she looked at it and remembered that sometimes the smallest choices, saying yes to a stranger, asking to share a table, opening a door instead of walking away, could change everything. Ford felt her smile against his shoulder. What are you thinking? He asked. That I'm glad the cafe was crowded that day. Me too, Ford said. Me too. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead go to watch the living, two souls smiled. A woman who'd loved her husband and son enough to ask them to keep living. A boy who'd loved his sister enough to forgive her for being late. Both of them pleased, perhaps, to see that love hadn't ended with them, that it had simply transformed, moved forward, found new shapes and new expressions in the people they'd left behind. The rain continued to fall. Inside, a family slept. And in the morning, when sunlight replaced storm, they would wake to coffee and laughter and the ordinary miracles of another day together. It wasn't the life any of them had planned, but it was the life they'd chosen, built from broken pieces and stubborn hope. And that, in the end, was more than enough. It was everything.